Indigenous rights in the mining industry have become a major issue in the last few decades. As companies have increasingly mined on indigenous lands for resources, indigenous peoples are often the most vulnerable and marginalized in society, and they are particularly affected by the development of the mining industry on their lands. This article will explore the history of indigenous rights in the mining industry, the current challenges facing indigenous peoples, and the steps being taken to address these issues. The history of indigenous rights in the mining industry can be traced back to the late 19th century, when European colonizers began to mine on indigenous lands in search of minerals, oil, and other resources. The indigenous peoples of these lands had very little say in the decision-making process and were often forcibly removed from their homes. This led to a long history of exploitation and discrimination against indigenous peoples, which has continued to this day. Today, the mining industry is one of the most important sources of economic growth in many countries, and it is often the only option for many indigenous communities. However, this growth has come at a cost to indigenous peoples, who are often left with few options but to accept the development of mining on their land. This has resulted in the displacement of indigenous communities, destruction of their traditional lands, and loss of their cultural heritage. Furthermore, the mining industry often fails to adequately consult with indigenous peoples and does not take into account their interests, concerns, or needs. This lack of consultation has led to further exploitation and has resulted in indigenous peoples not receiving their fair share of the benefits from mining. In recent years, there have been a number of steps taken to address the issue of indigenous rights in the mining industry. In particular, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, has provided an important framework for protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. The declaration recognizes the importance of free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) for indigenous peoples when it comes to development on their lands. This means that any development projects or agreements must first be discussed and agreed upon with the indigenous peoples before they can proceed. Furthermore, the International Labour Organization, ILO, has developed a number of conventions that are aimed at protecting the rights of indigenous peoples in the mining industry. These conventions focus on issues such as the right to collective bargaining, the right to equal pay for equal work, and the right to safe and healthy working conditions. Overall, the mining industry has a long history of exploiting and marginalizing indigenous peoples. However, there are now a number of steps being taken to address this issue, such as the UNDRIP and ILO conventions. It is important that these steps are taken seriously and that indigenous peoples are given the respect and protection they deserve.